Hello, everyone. Welcome to day one of Azure Community Conference. Hope you guys are having an amazing time today. I see there were some amazing sessions today. I wish I could see all of them. There are a lot of good sessions, especially related to security and automation topics. I wish I could just, listen to all of them live at a given point in time, but not possible. All right, let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jasjit, and I am a CEO of Pentara Technologies. It's a small company based out of Mohali, and we do a lot of consulting services based out of Mohali. For those of who are not familiar with the city, it's 5 hours north of New Delhi and right on the foothills of Himalayas. Pretty amazing city to live in overall. If you guys are around here, I would love to meet you and show you around. Happy to do that anytime. That particular title doesn't really do justice to my name. I feel like an imposter. I'm no CEO, to be honest. It's more about I'm a techie at heart, so I still consider myself as a cloud solutions architect per se. And my journey started way back. I've primarily done a lot of SharePoint work in the past. And I've seen SharePoint evolve from 2003 to 2019 and the SharePoint Online version, which is a little bit different in so many ways. And fun fact about me, I started working with computers when I was in 7th grade. It was an 80286 processor, and it had 256 kilobyte of RAM memory and only 40 MB of hard drive space. And of course, it was a black and white MS-DOS based computer. And I had a lot of fun learning on my own. So apart from what my school taught me, which was basic, I learned C, C++, COBOL, Pascal, Fortran, some databases, and a few other softwares that I don't even remember the names of at this point, to be frank. But yeah, it's been a long journey for me. What we specifically do at Pentara Technologies, we love building solutions, deploying, migrating our customers from different workloads to the cloud one way or the other, refactoring their current solution base, and helping them do better automation using different tools and making sure we give them the right analysis from going from their journey from point A to point B. And we're very strong with doing integration workloads as well in terms of getting data from, let's say you want to synchronize your profile from PeopleSoft, or you want data from Salesforce to flow into SharePoint and then eventually end up in Power Apps. We've done different scenarios like that. But this topic today is completely different. We're going to be talking about Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets. I want to be very clear on what we will cover here. This is not a one-on-one level 100 kind of a session. There is no practical demo, but we have so many topics to talk about in depth in terms of how virtual machine scale sets work in general. And this pretty much goes for every single Azure service out there today, because it's just so vast, and Microsoft has done a great job in terms of maturing their services, and that holds true for VM scale sets today as well. So without further ado, let's look at the agenda. Okay, so we're gonna briefly start with a small introduction of what VM scale sets are, and then look at design considerations and different ways how we can deploy it, more details on monitoring specifically, and then some of the new stuff that has come out with VM scale sets related to scale-in policies, termination notifications, and instance protection. Now, let's go through our introduction. I'm not going to cover too much time on this specifically. So, of course, there are virtual machine scale sets are a group of load balanced VMs. Now, this load balancing can happen in Azure Load Balancer, it can happen in Azure Application Gateway, or it can happen in your third-party appliance as well. There it gets a little tricky in terms of giving signaling back and forth to the service on when it's supposed to scale up and scale down. But you technically can do without these two options as well. And then that actually scenario is only in case of your custom monitoring aspects. I went way too advanced right away on this slide, but yeah, you can do automatic scaling, high availability, and for me the biggest benefit is about doing a centralized deployment and management for your workload that is not consistent. So the biggest thing that you want to take away from this is that when to use virtual machine scale sets, basically. And for me, that's more in scenarios where you have more or less unpredicted workloads. If you have pretty good prediction of what your workload is going to look like, I would rather spin up right size VMs and have my virtual machines available in availability sets to give high availability there, and not bring the complexity that comes on top of virtual machine scale set in terms of operations and management. So the another benefit here is that you only pay for just the virtual machine costs. So if you're running one virtual machine, you pay for one. If you run for two, so on and so forth. So the actual service fabric that helps you orchestrate and do everything in a virtual machine scale set, that doesn't cost you per se. And then of course, if you want to learn more in detail, I suggest you go to the official documentation given in the link here. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our next topic. Okay, now let's talk about design considerations. This is going to be the most lengthy topic of all of the others that we have on the agenda today. So before I start making any points here, you've already decided you want a VM scale set, basically. So you're at that decision point where you know your workload is sporadic and you don't want to plan for the highest capacity and keep it always up and running because it'll be cost prohibitive, basically. So you very well know that, okay, now you need a virtual machine scale set to help you with your sporadic demand specifically. So keep that in mind. Let's go ahead. So this is very interesting. I mean, this is a very basic concept that everybody would want to look into, but what I really want to emphasize from this point is, yes, it makes sense to look into that documentation and understand if you're doing compute intensive work, if you're doing GPU intensive workload, or whether it's a memory intensive workload. So you have to make sure you're picking the right VM for the best performance in that scenario. Okay, and then of course there are two types of scalability that is available to you. One is vertical, one is horizontal. So what is vertical scaling? Vertical scaling is basically you would want to just increase the existing capacity of the virtual machine. So you would want to increase the CPU if your CPU is getting bottlenecked, or you would want to increase the memory size if your memory is getting bottlenecked. So those are two examples of vertical scaling right there. And horizontal scaling is basically you take one virtual machine, add another one, and grow horizontally in that fashion, and increase your throughput and serve more end users like that. So when you combine these two topics together, right sizing and vertical and horizontal scaling, and you think about them holistically, well, if in a layman term, if I have to explain this, I basically explain this in terms of Lego blocks. So think of let's say the Lego blocks that have 4 dots on it, like a square shape. Let's for our scenario here, consider that that's the lowest possible skew of a virtual machine compute instance that Azure sells today. So you can actually start with that and have a very teeny tiny load on it, and make your application work. And based on the performance, it can stack up as many Lego blocks on top of it, but it can only stack the same size of Lego block on top of it. You cannot change the size. So that's why having the right size base VM is important. And your design consideration in this scenario would be to make sure there is, enough performance available for your average set of users if they come and hit at any given point in time and day, that they were able to look into that with a base capacity as well. So you can actually have recommendation is to have 2 virtual machines at minimum to have high availability if one goes down, right? So you would want to pick the right base. Now, why would you want to pick a larger size VM if you can have the lowest burst depending on your workload scenario? It depends. There are different scenarios or different considerations that come into picture here as well. So the very first one being is the time it takes for the service to scale up another VM, and by the time it joins the pool to be able to serve your customers might be different. And this is I'm gonna repeat that for a few other points as well that I'm gonna talk about, because your application deployment method and how you plan that can make a difference in this particular scenario. So if it takes 5 minutes for a VM to spin up, you might get within that 5 minutes enough surge in demand that, let's say you're only running on 3 VMs and it takes 5 minutes to add a VM, or by the time it spins up and gets added to the pool, the users already start getting bad performance, or they start getting they start hitting the threshold limits and the requests and the data packet loss starts happening, or the requests become really slow, and it just puts a negative impact on all the users. So again, you have to understand all of this and start. The other important fact, again, I'm gonna, even though this is a high level session, but it's always important to go back to the basics, which is that's perfectly fine that you're planning for the need of the hour and understand what is required today. But it is extremely important to have a vision. It's extremely important to understand that, okay, this is where I want to grow for this particular application. This is the kind of growth I'm expecting, and it's going to grow in 6 months, in 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10-year time frame in this particular fashion. You have to have that vision so you can understand that whatever decisions you will make today, what impact will it have tomorrow? Or if you want to simplify and go the easy route today, but understand that at any given point in time, if you hit that scalability point, you might have to consider different options where you might want to bring in better automation tools to give you that more efficiency versus doing manual tasks in the beginning. So keep that in mind. Okay, so how do we do application deployment? This is also very important while you're considering skill sets. One way is to build custom images, pretty standard. You can put all the data, information, whatever is required to run your application. A very simple example is your web frontends, basically for a website. You put them on VM skill sets, and they're all pretty much the same, and they connect to the same database. Your databases, you can run multiple databases and load balance them in a different VM skill set scenario, and have a common, have some synchronization mechanism, or use other common storage methodology to work on the database side. But you can use custom VM images in this scenario. You can use custom script extensions, pretty powerful there, and deploy your workload or your application packages according to that. You can use PowerShell DSC for Windows workloads. I really love this. And you can use Cloud Init for Linux workloads. So you need to come up front what methodology you would want to use. Now, another aspect to note here is if you are a small shop or a startup where you don't want to invest too much in creating custom VM images in the first place, because that takes a lot of time, you can start with custom script extension, or you could start with PowerShell or Cloud Init, depending on whether you have a Windows or a Linux workload. But overall, if you really scale and you want to grow, you should have some kind of process in mind that, okay, if I am at point A today and if I want to be at point B, I would rather prefer custom VM image deployment at a later stage where it's more robust to bring up additional VMs in that scenario. So again, depending on your use case scenarios, I'm not saying custom VM images is the best way to do it, but I prefer those over custom script or PowerShell, depending on the type of workload or the user scenarios that are there, requirement scenarios that are there, basically. All right, this is another important topic I wanted to cover here in your design considerations, because you need to understand a couple of things. First is you're using virtual machine. Virtual machines are infrastructure as a service, basically. So you have to manage how you will update them and how you will also not just update your operating system, make sure the security is up to date, all the patches, all the security updates, everything is installed on time. So that is something you'll have to manage on your end. Of course, Microsoft is coming up with newer ways to manage the OS updates for you as well, but keep in mind how the orchestration will work and how it will affect your workload. If Microsoft is going to manage those updates for you, it is possible. So make those decisions up front before jumping into and going ahead and creating a VM skill set. A lot of people miss that. Apps. Now, this is where you can use a lot of automation tools. In fact, for even OS, you can do that. These are just some of them that I'm mentioning here, but again, there are tons of them that are available out there other than these that you can use as well. So given hypothetical scenario can be where a developer checks in the code. You have a build service that builds that code. Again, it can be anywhere. It can be on premises, can be on cloud. Then you can use Packer to publish your build artifacts into an image and create that custom image and have that custom image automatically get uploaded to your image gallery. And then you start reassigning, you reassign your image gallery in the VM skill set, and then you start the upgrade process for your instances one by one, so the service is not disrupted. So one of the big advantages that I really love about VM skill set is that you can go from point A to point B in your application from whether it's an upgrade path or whether it's a design change, whether it's another feature you're implementing, and gradually upgrade and make changes without disrupting existing services at all. All right, let's look at the next slide. Now, here you have to understand how auto scaling will work. Now, for auto scaling to work, you really have to understand what options are available for me to do the auto scaling on in the first place, right? So in this case, you have metric sources that are available to you, that you can, different ways you can get to the metric sources, basically, where you can do your auto scaling off of. Of course, I would expect that you guys know to some extent that you can always check on memory and compute very easily, and understand if how your CPU is going up to a certain level, you can maintain or scale in or scale out, depending on that, those metrics specifically. But you have to make a decision beforehand where your metric sources are going to live and how you're going to configure them. So by default, you have the current scale set that is available. So for this, basically, you do not require any additional agents to be installed or configured on your VM. Then you have your storage account. So the diagnostic extension can write those performance metrics specifically, and then you can consume them to trigger your autoscale rules, basically. And then another option is service bus queue, where your application can transmit these messages basically to this queue, and then that queue can be used to trigger the rules. And the fourth option is your application insights, basically. So over there, you can have your package installed within your application itself, and it will stream the metrics directly from there, and you can consume them to trigger these auto scale in or out rules, basically. Then you have your auto scale rule criteria specifically. So this is where you will define. And again, the good part is if you use ARM templates to deploy your VM scale sets, you have far more control over these auto scale rules. Of course, the UI has matured a lot, but you can do more complex scenarios over there. But with auto scale rules, you can define CPU based, memory based. You can define depending on your what metric sources you've picked. Again, for example, if you go with the basic one, the current scale set, it might not give you the memory metrics, so you might have to go with a storage account or another method that I spoke about earlier. And then you will decide. You can actually add multiple auto scale rules here, so keep that in mind. I can spin up a VM if CPU is getting bottlenecked. I can spin up a VM if memory is getting bottlenecked. I can spin up a VM unscheduled. All of these can be combined in one single VM skill set. And you can also make sure that come holiday season, come sale, if you put on something, if you're a retail manufacturer and you're putting stuff on sale and you're expecting traffic to your website, you can schedule that, okay, on this day beforehand, make sure I have a minimum capacity of these VMs. And then, of course, even after that, if it goes beyond that, your auto scale rules can again go beyond that and help provision more VMs if all of them have been, fully utilized from whatever metrics you define, like processor, memory, or disk queue. In that scenario, you can use that as well. So that should help you understand where your auto scaling will stand. All right, let's move on to our next point. Okay, so next up is availability. So here you need to understand whether you want to deploy your VM skill set in a non-zonal or a zonal mode. Basically, you want to put them in availability zones or not. And every region, I'm not going to cover that topic, but every region in Azure has availability zones, and you can deploy them. They have their own fault domains and update domains, like your availability sets, and they make sure that your services are up and running and gives you a certain level of SLAs, right? So whatever service level agreement you want, you can, specifically control the aspect of how these virtual machines will be spun up in your scale set. And for that, you need to look into how availability zones work. But the options that are available to you in terms of deploying these is either you'll be using the max spreading option, which in most cases will fulfill your requirement. Otherwise, you can give static fixed spread options as well, where it will, you can say that, okay, I want my VM skill set to be spread across 3 fault domains, 4 fault domains, or 5. You define that number. But be mindful in that scenario, if any region where you're deploying your VM skill set, that many fault domains are not available, your deployment will fail, right? And then the third option is that it will be aligned with your storage disk account fault domain, basically. So those are your 3 options. Again, no brainer. Most cases here, you should be good with max spreading, and always choose availability zone option there. It helps scale better. Then the next topic is again connected with the first one, the proximity placement groups. What it does allow you to do and how it works is even though there are multiple availability zones within a region, you have to understand that the Azure footprint is growing physically within a region. So you might end up having performance issues if those VMs are far apart, right? So if you want to keep them together, you would want to place them in the correct placement groups. However, if those placement groups are not available, you will get a failure in deploying. And this is specifically when you're scaling in and scaling out these Scotties. When you're adding more VMs, this can become a problem depending on the placement group's availability. So keep that in mind. It does help a lot in terms of if you're deploying a very critical workload and it requires a large number of VMs and they need to talk to each other, or they need to talk to certain database that needs to be in the same proximity group for you to achieve certain level of performance. Understand how these proximity placement groups can give you a boost in your performance in those specific workloads. Okay, now of course this is another consideration. It's just a simple pointer where you need to understand how vCPU quotas work. Virtual machines, there are different quotas that are available to you within a subscription for availability sets, for virtual machine scale sets, and then there are others. One is based on your total region, and the other one is based on different scenarios, possible scenarios. So you need to make sure that you are mindful of your vCPU quotas within subscription. Of course, you can make a request to increase them in any circumstance where you think you need more than your quota in that particular subscription. So you can go ahead and ask Microsoft support to increase them for you, right? And then we have certain VM skill set properties that cannot be changed once deployed. For example, if you place them in availability zones, you cannot change them afterwards. You have to completely redeploy your VM skill set. And then another example here can be the storage type, right? So if you used managed disks, you cannot switch back to storage accounts in that scenario. And then you have your properties that cannot be changed until and unless you deallocate your VM. So one example can be a SKU change, right? So if you start with a certain series of VM and you want to go bigger, it will require deallocation at that point in time. So keep these point in mind. Let's move on to our next point here. Okay, so Azure policies. I'm not going to cover that topic in detail at this stage, but if you're a large organization and you're using Azure, you probably already have policy definitions. So first, go through all your already existing policies to make sure there won't be any conflicts in the first place while you're deploying these skill sets. Otherwise, your deployments will be a waste, and you will end up wasting time in the first place. Or if you're a startup, it's a good time at this stage to look into what Azure policies are and what they can do for you from a governance standpoint. It's always good to have some base policies defined. Now, the good thing is Microsoft gives you a whole set of built-in policies that are applicable for just VM skill sets. So I definitely recommend, highly recommend, in fact, to go ahead and look into those built-in policies and see if you would want to deploy them and make them applicable to your VM skill sets. This will help you improve your security posture as well in a way that you might not have imagined. So definitely a big point in design consideration. Now, I can speak about this security topic for another 2 days, but I'm gonna cover it in a very short span in terms of follow your best practices, whatever you do for creating VMs in Azure in general. Make sure you don't expose any unnecessary ports on the public front in any form or fashion to your VM instances. Keep them internal, and follow your best practices for security in handling your secrets and passwords while doing deployment and everything, and keep them secure in a vault like Azure Vault, or make sure they're masked in a way, or use enhanced mechanisms of talking to each other instead of using passwords. Use certificates instead, and rotate those certificates. So again, there are so many best practices. Just follow them in general. And for other aspect where you shouldn't ignore security is on the automation front when you do automation. So make sure all of these secrets are safeguarded in a way where they cannot be exploited in any form or fashion. Very important. All right, last but not the least, storage. So of course, this is a no-brainer. You should just go for managed disks. Don't use storage accounts. A lot of benefits here. I'm not going to cover the benefits of managed disks at this point, but your limitations on how far you can scale the number of VMs that you can have will depend on this decision factor as well. So normal storage accounts, there is the limitations are really bad. The numbers are very low. How many VMs you can scale up accordingly there, but when it comes to managed disks, it really greatly improves your setup there. And then this is an interesting one: ephemeral OS disks. If you further want to enhance or improve your performance, or get really fast scale up times, or you want to add a VM really fast, and you want the VM to operate in a much better read-write latency disk process. What ephemeral disks are, basically they are disks that are attached to the physical host itself, where the VM is. So you can only pretty much use them in scenarios where you have a stateless operation. So basically what that means is you can lose a VM at any given point of time and it won't make a difference to your overall service SLA that you're providing to anyone at that point in time. So look into this and make your design considerations accordingly, and hopefully these considerations were really helpful to you guys. We're gonna go ahead and move on to our next topic now. Okay, let's look at our deployment methods next. So for deployment methods for applications, we've covered a couple of them before, but let's do this. You can use off-the-shelf solutions in Marketplace and deploy from there. You can use VM extensions, you can use custom data, and you can use configuration manager like DSC to deploy your application, of course. And then you have your containerized deployments, of course. VM Skillset supports containers. And last but not the least, we've covered custom images as well. So these are your possible scenarios, so keep them in mind, which one you want to pick and go with. All of them have their pros and cons, and there is no best practice, or there is no favorite solution that you should go for. But usually, if you can put a package and do a deployment using VM extensions, that would be more preferable rather than going the custom data route for me, because I would want to see standard VM extensions or use already created VM extensions that are out there on GitHub and reuse them and go from there. And in certain scenarios, they are considered security risks as well. So you might want to host those extensions on your own storage account and use them from there. That's always an option. Okay, for VM scale sets, I think we've covered this, but you can do ARM templates, that gives you the most flexibility. And same with CLI and PowerShell. It totally depends on you what you want to pick here. But there's one more option. Of course, you can use automation tools like Jenkins, Azure pipelines. You can use Ansible. So there's so many different other options available that you can use to make these deployment using other orchestration engines, right? So make a decision and understand how will you get your skill set deployed, how will you get your application deployed, and how will you manage the operation and maintenance going forward on both the fronts, right? And of course, a lot of documentation available on docs.microsoft.com on VM scale sets. These guys have done a good job in explaining different scenarios and given a lot of custom code and examples to get you started in any possible way that you want to pick from these options. All right, let's move on to monitoring now. Okay, so for monitoring, this is actually not that different from what you do with your normal VM monitoring. So you have your different sources of data. So you get your activity logs from the subscription level, then you get your performance, the platform metrics specifically from the virtual machine host, and then from virtual machine guest, you get data from your diagnostic extension or your log analytics agent, basically, right? And then you combine them with your Azure monitor service along with your log analytical workspace. And using this combination, you can actually gain insights into what's happening with your skill sets and how your VMs are scaling in and scaling out, what specific rules, if you have multiple rules, are triggering those scale out or scale in, and what scale in policies applied. We'll cover that next now. Okay, let's look at custom policies, scale-in policies, basically. So as your workload expands, or evolves within your skill set, you might have different configurations that are functions within your VMs. Not recommended, but again, there are scenarios that fall into this category, and you would want to have such scenarios. And in that case, you would want to control how the scale in happens, basically, right? So Microsoft has come up with this. This is fairly recent in terms of, yes, it's been there since couple of months. Sorry, not couple of months. It's been there for quite a while now, but it's still less than a year old when they came up with this. So you have three different scale-in configurations available to you: default, newest VM, and oldest VM. So in default scale-in policy, you would basically Microsoft would balance all the VMs across the availability zones, if you have a zonal configuration in the first place, and make their best effort to distribute them across the fault domains. And in this case, when the scale-in happens, the deletion of the VM will happen with the highest instance ID. So basically, the last one that was scaled up is the one that's going to go out using the default. Now, for the newest VM scale-in policy, that would basically delete the newest created VM in the scale set after it has done the balancing across the availability zones, basically. And for the oldest, it will delete the oldest created virtual machine within that scale set. And once the balancing is done, after whatever rules have triggered, and this requires a configuration change if you want to move from newest to from newest VM to default, or from newest VM to oldest. So you can go ahead and do that at a later stage if you want. All right. Okay, let's look at termination, notifications, and instance protection. So Microsoft has introduced this feature recently, and you can basically put predefined delayed timeout. Recently, I think this was around February timeframe, so been a while from tech innovation or tech timeline perspective. All right, so you can put anywhere from 5 to 15-minute timeout over there. And the notifications are basically sent via scheduled events, so Azure metadata service, and you can consume them. They're only generated for delete events, so keep that in mind. Not when you update, upgrade, or make changes to that specific instance. That's not gonna do this. Well, that will disrupt your service, but you can, use those other events in your hook to keep them out of your load balancer as well. Of course, they cannot be enabled for low priority VMs. They will only be enabled for, non-low priority VMs, because low priority VMs can be evicted within 30 seconds, but you get notifications for those as well, by the way. And then, of course, you also have instance protection. This is really very handy where, when your workload grows and evolves, you might want to put special workloads in certain scenarios, maybe temporarily or maybe on a permanent basis. Totally depends on your use case scenario, where you might be running long operations, or you might be running certain other tasks that are not given to other VMs in your scale set. So in that case, you can apply two kinds of policies: protection from scale-in, or you can apply protection from scale set actions. So the difference between the two is basically one would also protect you from, basically the latter one would protect you from upgrade and other scale set actions that would want that instance to be unavailable at any given point in time, whereas the previous one, the scale-in protection, will only prevent it from getting deleted in the autoscaling process. So keep these in mind. All right, that's it from my end. Thank you to our sponsors, Microsoft and GitHub. And of course, there are so many different communities that are out there that have helped made this conference possible. So a huge applause for them. I represent Mohali here, Punjab. That's what you see over there. And yeah, if you are around these different cities, go ahead and reach out to these people, amazing people who are running these communities and trying to give back in any possible way they can. Thank you, everyone. Take care and enjoy. Have an amazing rest of the day. Keep learning.